Warning: contains adult language, adult content, psychological nudity. Listener discretion is advised.
So everyone's been talking about this GQ Jordan Peterson interview. Let's get right into it.
How much responsibility do you feel that you have, particularly to guys, the alt-right, who, as you say, some of them have enjoyed your work, and say,
No,
I'm not one of you guys. I'm not with you guys.
They haven't enjoyed my work.
I've definitely read bits on the internet.
Read more.
So right away we see that they're posing this as a battle, Jordan versus an interviewer, and they know exactly what they're doing here, and I'm sure Jordan does, and this woman does. It's all for publicity and good ratings, and maybe it'll do something good for Jordan and do something good for her. And I realize all of this, but I still enjoyed the interview. So let's check out some more of it.
You've sold 2 million copies of 12 Rules for Life. You have 800,000 followers on Twitter, 1.4 million followers on YouTube. What is it that you're selling that so many people want to buy?
I don't think I'm selling anything.
I thought that was an interesting response to the first question. And it kind of ties a lot into the Owen Benjamin criticisms and some comments I've been getting on my previous videos about those Owen Benjamin criticisms of Jordan Peterson, that he's a man selling something, and then Owen starts to deconstruct what he's selling and how he's selling it, to the point where Jordan is just a fraud and a sort of snake oil salesman. I still don't see it that way. I'm open to seeing it that way, but I thought this answer was interesting. He has a nice, interesting little grin on his face as he says, "I'm not selling anything." What are we to make of this? Because then she'll reply right away that, well, I did see you at a show to which you sold tickets. So you're obviously selling something. You have a book out and you're selling the book, and you're selling your persona. You're selling some kind of influence, some kind of knowledge to people, and people seem to want to buy it. Now, the critique I have of Owen Benjamin, again, I'm just going to bring this up very shortly. Owen takes the stance of a free market capitalist person, and then he uses a criticism against Jordan for being too capitalist. That's my criticism. It does not work within Owen's frame of reference. So for Owen to make that criticism makes no sense. However, if Bernie Sanders were to make the criticism that Owen is making, it would make a lot of sense, and it would be congruent with what Bernie Sanders believes. It's not congruent with what Owen believes. So here we are. She is right away trying to dig at Jordan's capitalistic money-making efforts.
Well, I went to a show where you were selling tickets to your show, so people are willing to pay a lot of money to see you speak. You know, what is it that you think that people are hungry for? They want to hear from you.
They're hungry for a discussion of the relationship between responsibility and meaning. And we haven't had that discussion in our culture for 50 years. We've concentrated on rights and privileges and freedom and impulsive pleasure, and those are all useful in their place, but they're shallow, and that's not good, because if people are moored shallowly, then storms wreck them, and storms come along. So
that's one of Jordan's most powerful points, is that there will be a flood in your life, just as there was a flood in the Old Testament. And, you know, there's a reason why there's a story about the flood in every culture. Jordan brings that out. He brings out the psychological meaning, the metaphorical meaning, in sort of plain English so that everybody can understand it. And Jordan has been doing this, you know, for so many years that he sort of fine-tuned the language he uses and the way he presents these ideas. And doing so many of these combative interviews also allows him to fine-tune how he dodges and weaves and throws out some punches in these interviews much better than anybody else I've seen, as far as presenting points logically, rationally, even emotionally at some points, to the other side. Now see, this is where people say, well, he's a right wing versus left wing, but it's only because he's been paired up with these left-wing pundits mostly. Journalists by and large are left-wing, and they by and large buy into the misinformation about Jordan. And what's also interesting is that people like Owen Benjamin, who perceive Peterson as crossing those political boundaries, are kind of doing the same thing that the left-wing journalists had been doing to Jordan all this time, to which Owen had usually responded negatively to, but now he's in line with all the left-wing journalists, and he's in line with what they've been saying about Jordan from the beginning. Very interesting point. If you come from the right wing, if you come from Owen Benjamin's side of things.
So I'm talking to people about how they can build a foundation underneath them that works, and people need to know that, because otherwise their lives are harder than they need to be.
What is it that you have that no one else has? What are you offering that no one else is right now?
Well, I think that is what I'm offering. That's not part of the public discussion, and it's grounded in my clinical knowledge. So I've been a clinician for a very long time, and I'm familiar with the works of most of the great 20th century clinicians, and a reasonable amount of philosophy, and a good swath of literature, and I'm a credible scientist, and so I can bring that all together.
That right there is sort of the key issue for me, is that Jordan was a scientist, as a psychologist, as a professor. He did very well in his field of psychology, so he is credible in that sense. And when he tries to get to a mythological or metaphorical point, he'll often start with a scientific analysis or some kind of fact-based analysis, like he does with bringing up the lobsters regarding the hierarchy. So there's a social problem regarding hierarchies, and so he says, let's look at this through another lens, because the feminists and SJWs are saying that this is sort of a patriarchal human problem that's about how we're structuring societies as human beings. And he says, actually, if we look at this through a broader lens and at the same time a more specific lens, looking at the animal kingdom and then zeroing in on the lobsters, this sheds new light on this problem of hierarchies. And so Jordan, as he'll mention later on, allows us to have at once a broader perspective, and then also lasering in on the very specific problem that we're talking about.
And tried to bring it all together and to make a case for the significance of individual life and the psychological necessity of courage and nobility and responsibility, these things that sound old-fashioned, but are old-fashioned in the best sense. They're old-fashioned because they've lasted forever and they're absolutely necessary. And people need a call to responsibility because they need to mature. They need to want to be adults. And I don't think we do a very good job in our culture of making a case for why it's a good thing to be an adult.
And two things really made you famous, which is, first of all, is the book, 12 Rules for Life. Mm-hmm. The second one, I think, was an interview that went viral with Kathy Newman of Channel 4 News, which you talked about men and women.
Joe Rogan's podcasts help plenty too.
All right, he's got a big...
So Jordan just mentioned Joe Rogan's podcast, and she was mentioning Kathy Newman. So again, she was sort of having a one-sided view of this thing, using the book and Kathy Newman as things that launched Jordan Peterson into fame and notoriety. But really, there is this other side of the coin. It's Joe Rogan's podcast. How many has he done now? Four or five? He's done quite a few of Joe Rogan's podcasts. And I remember thinking back when Jordan had 65,000 followers on YouTube, and Joe Rogan, I believe, at the time of Jordan's first appearance, had somewhere like in the upper 600s, I think, or maybe lower 700s of thousands. And I thought, wow, this could be really impactful for Jordan's following. And I believe right after that first appearance, Jordan doubled or tripled his followers on YouTube, and so that was certainly one of the first launches of Jordan into the public arena. If you want to think of the American consciousness, Joe Rogan sort of allows people to get into the American consciousness. And now look at what does Peterson have? He has 1 million or 2 million. He's got quite a few more followers on YouTube now than Joe Rogan had when he first went on Joe Rogan.
big following. But that was, I think, really fascinating, that interview, because it was specifically about men and women. And you said at the time, you know, YouTube skews very male and your fan base is very male. Is that still the case? Are you still primarily talking to men?
I would say the talks are probably 60-40, 65-35 male to female. The book sales, I don't know. I doubt it, because usually it's women who buy books, although men do buy nonfiction if they buy books. We don't know the demographics on the books. But the book has definitely expanded my audience, I would say. And that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I never set out specifically to talk to men. My students for most years at university have been primarily female. I think most of my graduate students have been female. It might be about 50-50, but I think it would probably tilt more in the direction of female. So it wasn't something I set out to do. I think, though, that, as I said earlier, well, I can't tell how much of it is merely a consequence of the fact that YouTube skews so male. It might also be something to do with the call to take on voluntary responsibility. I'm not exactly sure why that would be more necessary for men right now. I think it might be because our culture confuses men's desire for achievement and competence with the patriarchal desire for tyrannical power. And that's a big mistake. Those aren't the same thing, even a bit. So, and it's very inappropriate psychologically and sociologically to confuse them. So.
Well, one of the things I want to come back to is this idea. So that you say in the book, you know, there is masculine order and feminine chaos.
No, actually, I say that those are symbolic representations of the two things.
Right. Okay. So why? Why is order masculine?
I just don't understand why people keep bringing this up over and over again. They don't seem to understand why feminine is related to chaos and masculine to order. I don't understand how they don't understand that. They don't seem to understand. I mean, is it that they're taking things too literally, that there is no literal masculine order and literal feminine chaos? Do they not see things on a non-literal basis? I'll let Jordan answer the question, but I don't think his answer was the best answer I've ever heard. I think if you pick up one of the books he recommends is The Origins and History of Consciousness by Eric Neumann, and that goes into this in quite some detail. But yeah, let's hear what Jordan has to say.
I think it's because our primary social hierarchy structures are fundamentally masculine.
And that's not the patriarchy?
Well, it's not the modern idea of the patriarchy, that's for sure.
I mean, that's my idea of the patriarchy, which is a system of male dominance of society.
Yeah, but that's not my sense of the patriarchy.
So what's yours?
Well, in what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
A very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely?
Let's drop some lead on those motherfuckers!
Is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
A very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely? What you're doing is you're taking a tiny substrata of hyper-successful men and using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
Reload! Reload! Fire mechanism reset! Secure the hatch! Port side
using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
But I could say equally well that most rape victims are women. You know, terrible things happen to people of both sexes.
And you could say that with perfect utility, but that doesn't provide any evidence for the existence of a male-dominated patriarchy. Well, it just means that terrible things happen to both genders, which they certainly do.
But there are almost no women who rape men, for example. So that is an asymmetry there in sexual violence.
They ain't gonna sink this battleship, no way.
Well, yes, there's an asymmetry in all sorts of places, but that doesn't mean that Western culture is a male-dominated patriarchy. The fact that there are asymmetries has nothing to do with your basic argument.
No, but you might equally...
This is a trope that people just accept. Western society is a male-dominated patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. That's not true. And even if it has a patriarchal structure to some degree, the fundamental basis of that structure is not power, it's competence. That's why our society works. It's only when a structure degenerates into tyranny that the fundamental relationships between people become dependent on power. It's not power. If you hire a plumber who's likely to be male, it's not because there's roving bands of tyrannical plumbers forcing you to make that choice.